Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. How are you doing this afternoon, I should say, Nora, instead of this morning? We're recording this a little later than usual.
Very well, thank you. It's a sunny, beautiful day here in Sacramento, California, and I'm just looking forward to, it hasn't been hot yet. We've had 3 days of heat, and that's it. So it's been really, really lovely.
Wow, we have had the biggest heat spell over here. It has been so nasty and humid, and you'd think it's going to rain. Great. It'll cool everything off. No, it makes it twice as bad. It's suddenly a sauna. It goes from a dry sauna to a wet sauna immediately, and it is nasty. When the dog doesn't even want to go outside, you know it's a little too hot.
Day.
Yeah.
That's a bad day.
So, we were talking and thought that a great topic for today would be we've already done a topic on stability versus mobility, and I think we covered a lot of the stabilization aspect, which I think you and I are both proponents of, that's very important, especially in what we do. But let's talk about mobility because, oh my gosh, for the last probably 5-7 years at all these conferences, there have been so many more classes talking about mobility. And I thought, why don't we discuss this a little bit and try and figure out why are we doing it? What is it? How does it relate to what we already thought of as stretching? For so many years, it's called stretching. And let's do a deeper dive into this and try and figure out, what is it and why should we do it? How do we do it? And go from there.
Perfect. Yeah, it's definitely a topic I know being at IDEA, being in various different places at conferences and things that comes up. And it's funny because there's so many different ways that people talk about mobility and so many different aspects. And it really is kind of this funny umbrella term that I've decided is very inaccurate it just includes a lot of different things, everything from stretching to myofascial release work, to yoga, to all kinds of other things, myofascial stretch therapy. There's just a lot of things in that umbrella. And I thought if we can open that out a little bit, define a little bit more and discuss it, that would be great.
Yeah, the first time I think I ever ran into this in training was, I forget who brought it up, but somebody out of the Southwest had this sort of pre-training. So, before you started your training, you would do not necessarily prehab, but pre-training. So before your core work and all of that, and it involved a lot of exercises that sort of enhanced flexibility and enhanced movement and enhanced motion. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought, okay. And I tried to do that with some of my clients, and to the detriment of my clients, what we found was that this was designed for athletes and not for, the general population and not for clients who might be injured. So I realized real quick, okay, not my population. Got it. You really have to pick and choose who those exercises were for. But I still thought the concept was pretty clever on trying to, train before you train. And I thought, that was very interesting. And like we said, what's really come up in the last few years is sort of, all about mobility. And I think it still goes mostly for athletes and mostly for that population is what it's been geared for. And let's face it, everybody who's in fitness is sort of wants to consider themselves an athlete of some sort, a weekend warrior of some design. But is it really for the general population? So I thought, let's start right at the beginning. Let's define it. What is mobility? What would you say it is? Because I have a thought in my head, but let's see how close we are to an agreeable term.
When I was thinking about this, I had the same experience you did, which is what do we mean by mobility? And that was what started me off when we started talking about this topic and thinking about this topic. Like, what do we mean by mobility? What's the point of it? I mean, mobility, being mobile, being able to move. Just the most basic definition of the word is being able to move. Okay, that's good. As opposed to immobile, not being able to move. So, at a very basic level, that's what we're looking for in everything we do because we're about movement. But something that really came up was looking at things like sometimes you're working with a client where their mobility is limited, and that's causing trouble. A classic example of that is something like tight hip flexors, which really leads to inhibition of the glutes and hamstrings, can have some postural implications, can put stress on the low back in certain ways, right? So there is a limitation in mobility or range of motion at a certain joint that perhaps could be addressed to make them perform a little bit better. So that's one aspect of mobility.
Absolutely. How would you, now for me, I did a lot of research when I was working for another company developing their education and things, and I had to go through and figure out how to use this piece of equipment for, everything, because, every company thinks that their equipment is the panacea. It's going to cure all ills and all this kind of stuff. And it was a good product. So I did a lot of flexibility research. And what I found is a stack of articles that said flexibility is great, and a stack of articles that said flexibility is complete waste of your time. And now with mobility training being so good, I thought, well, what's the difference between flexibility and mobility? And my definition with this, and see if you agree, mobility has to do, in my mind, with motion and sort of your own self-propelled motion, putting your body through some motion, some ranges of motion, whereas flexibility could be almost a little bit more passive, not as active. Mobility is a little bit more active in my mind, whereas flexibility is a little bit more passive, because that's how we have always described it. The sit and reach test, hamstring flexibility, all of that sort of thing. So in my mindset, it's always been, active versus passive. Does that make sense?
Okay. I like that. No, I think that, yes, because flexibility, you picture flexibility as being a stretch, lying down, stretching your hamstring, or doing a pec stretch against the wall. So that's how you think about flexibility.
Yep.
And mobility is broader than that.
And
right?
usually involves
it's
motion.
how you move. And more active. Yeah, exactly. I'll go with that. I think we can go with that as a definition.
So
at least as we start out here.
Exactly. And by the end of this, we may have come up with completely different definitions. But so that's always been sort of in my mindset, trying to do more motion, because as we're doing exercises, we're creating motion. And I mean, that's what this podcast is all about, creating movement. So when we are trying to enhance motion, what are we really trying to achieve? We look at the charts, and you did a big breakdown of all the different body parts and, trying to figure out ranges of motion. And there were no two, authorities that agreed upon anything. Everything was completely different. Some took a cadaver and, which had no tension on it. And some took, athletes, and some took, average people. There was no consensus.
Right. Ranges of motion, you look at the research for a lot of things, and I was just doing it again for another project, the advancement principles, and it's like, okay, I mean, some of the ranges aren't very big. They might be, 10 or 20 degrees, which isn't that big a difference. But sometimes it's like 60 degrees difference in different resources for the same area.
And that shouldn't
be. And you're thinking, number one, that shouldn't be. And they're also clearly doing completely different ways of measuring it, right? And so there's no even agreement about, at least this is in the spine particularly, how you even measure what range of motion is in there. So yeah, there's not a lot of agreement on that. And the other thing too is, range of motion, especially when you're young, like say if you've got a baseball player, you've got a ballerina, or you've got an ice skater, somebody who's using rather extreme ranges of motion from a young age, they will change the range of motion in their joints anyway, right? So there is, normal range of motion for somebody, the functional range of motion that they need to do their daily life. And then there's the things that happen to mobility through movement, lack of movement, certain activities, etc.
Yeah. And what you do regularly is how your body's going to conform. I mean, this goes, right. I don't know if I ever told you this. My mom got into the whole Jane Fonda thing really, really early, was one of the first aerobic instructors in Hawaii. She wanted to increase her flexibility. So guess who was her guinea pig? and stretched with her every single night as a preteen. I was probably 8, 9, 10 years old at this point. And you know that stretch where you're sort of a straddle stretch, so your feet are wide and you grab,
Yeah.
both of you are feet to feet and you lean forward and you lean back and all of this. We did that every day practically for a long period of time to increase her flexibility. Well, you know what? My hamstring flexibility to this day is still way more than almost any guy I know. At one point, even at my biggest, I could kick my leg well over my head. And
Wow.
and it's because I worked at it at such a young age and did it for such a long period of time during those formative
Yeah.
ages that it
Consistently.
really enhanced that. Whereas you look at my genetics, my father, hamstrings, his hamstrings were made for someone who's 5'2", not 5'9", 5'10", so there's a big difference. And so whatever you do regularly is going to, dictate what you're going to see as your outcome years and years and years later. And we see this with a lot of dancers.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you spend a lot of time trying to get your leg behind you and your back up, basically an extension, you open up the front of your hip. You increase the range of motion in the front of the hip. You just do. Or same thing with a baseball player. They'll really change the range of motion in their shoulders, so they got a huge amount of external rotation, or a lot of rotation, and not as much internal rotation or medial rotation, just because that's what pitching requires. So kind of
Absolutely.
their arm goes way, way back behind it. We're same thing with the tennis serve. So what you do creates that mobility from a young age, but as you age, so thinking about the other end of the spectrum, um, you watch somebody older move who's not a particularly graceful mover. And what do you see? You see limitations in range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
You see that they may shuffle a bit. Their ankles may not work very well. They may not rotate their torso much. Their arms may not move much. They may be nervous about putting something overhead, you know. And so there's a lack of mobility that can come with age. And so maintaining mobility just for functional activities is like the other end of the spectrum. There's,
Absolutely.
changing range of motion to be able to really improve joint mechanics, for example. But there's also just maintaining the ability to move as you age and grow.
Well, think about, our elderly population. How many of them lack dorsiflexion, plantar flexion because they stop taking larger steps because of fear of falling? They shorten their stride, they begin to shuffle, and before long, they can't lift their toes off the ground. They have no dorsiflexion. They can't go up on their toes. They have no plantar flexion. And it's from, 5, 7, 10 years of shrinking their gait.
Yep, not using their feet,
Yeah,
right? Not moving.
not
Feet
moving.
immobile or relatively immobile. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's talk through some of those pieces,
Yeah.
right? So I want to start too with something else that I hear a lot, especially from people who train more men and more athletes, which is always start with mobility and then go to stability. Like I hear that a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I appreciate that. But I also know that in the population that I've worked with, particularly the dancer population, it tends to be a hypermobile population,
Mm-hmm.
or can be. And I've often had to go the other way around. They've got the flexibility, they've got the mobility, their hips can go wherever you want them to go, but they don't have the control and the strength and the stability to use that range of motion effectively. So that's one version. But coming back to the other version, very often we are I would say the highest priority in terms of mobility training is increasing a range of motion that is currently limiting something that somebody wants to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, for example, if somebody is really kyphotic and their chest is really tight and they really can't straighten up their back, and I know they've got neck and shoulder problems, I'm going to want to increase the openness of their chest, increase the mobility of their shoulders, increase the mobility of their thoracic spine and extension, so I can get them upright enough to hopefully improve the biomechanics of the whole shoulder girdle and neck and head.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you're looking at anybody, any client, it should come down to the individual. When
Yeah.
you are working with the dancer, or especially a lot of females who, are younger, who have participated in sports and whatnot, some of them may have incredible ranges of motion and lead to hypermobility and can't control their joints. Whereas you do see a lot of other people who have postural deficits, or your former athlete in their 20s, and I'm thinking a lot of males here, but females as well, who are very active and suddenly in their 40s or when they're seeking out personal trainers or Pilates instructors, and they've been sitting for the last 15 to 20 years. And that lack of movement, you see they're kyphotic, you see they're round shouldered, you see their tight hip flexors, you see their tight hamstrings. And that needs to be addressed, and often needs to be addressed, fairly soon in their, training. But at the same time, if they don't have the stability of the other body parts, I find that overdoing mobility training at the beginning can actually be a detriment to other things. And I see this a lot in yoga, where,
Yeah, yeah.
where too many people are trying to explore that range of motion, whereas a tight body part is restricting something, but they're trying to force it anyway. Well, something else is going to give.
Yeah, when you talk about the kinetic chain, which we may have mentioned before, or if not, we'll mention it now, right? Everything works together. If you're
Mm-hmm.
doing downward dog in yoga, right? A classic downward dog, hands on the floor, feet are on the floor, your hips up. Um, there's the whole thing has to contribute something to that position, right? The shoulder range of motion, because you're in pretty much full, flexion, if you will, on that. Hip flexion, how much hamstring mobility you have, what the calves are doing. Like there's all these pieces that need to participate in that. And if any one of them is not participating, somebody else will take the job.
Yep.
Right? I mean, the classic one that I see a lot, especially our low back clients, is super tight hamstrings, very, very short hamstrings, so that when they, let's say they sit on the ground or they sit with their legs out in front of them, they don't have the hamstring length, so they end up in lumbar flexion.
Mm-hmm.
Right, classic, right? It's classic. And that puts stress on the discs and stress on the posterior spine, and then you can run into trouble from that. So, this is where looking at that whole chain and trying to create coordinated mobility through that whole chain is something that you're looking for in your assessment, and in certainly your first few days with a client.
Mm-hmm. And I think being more gentle with it rather than trying to force it. I see a lot of people, I go to gyms, everywhere I go to, and you see trainers, and some of whom are trying to force ranges of motion, trying to force stretching. And I'm not sure how much you see of this in the Pilates world, but even just lying down, when you take, a knee into the chest and you rotate it to the opposite side, you'll see someone really almost try and do a chiropractic move where they're trying to drive that knee down and drive the shoulder in the opposite direction to get that
Right.
rotation. It's like, hey, why not allow the body over time to begin to stretch? Push it to a level 5 to 6 on a scale of 1 to 10 rather than, jamming it into a 9 right off the bat, where something often is going to give. I think being a little more gentle and allowing us to take our time can actually show better benefit in the end.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how you change range of motion in an area,
Okay.
right? Because that's what you're getting to.
Yep.
If you're trying to change range of motion somewhere, hamstrings, we'll just use hamstrings because they're a pretty classic example. Number one, you can pull the heck out of them. That is not going to change their range of motion. You have got to give it time to adapt, because what are the components that are required to change your range of motion? I mean, first of all, you have to overcome the stretch reflex,
Right.
wherever that's happening from, whether it's happening in the fascia, whether it's happening in the Golgi tendon organs, whether it's happening in the other bits and pieces of that, the muscle spindles. So those are mechanisms within the body that tell us how far the muscle's going, how fast it's moving, what its range is, and either we'll stop the muscle going there, or we'll do something else to try to make sure that you're safe. And I would argue that for some people, those guardrails, if you will, are over enthusiastic.
Mm-hmm.
So there is actually more tissue potential for range of motion than our stretch reflex is allowing us to have. And you'll see that when somebody actually relaxes and suddenly that hamstring, instead of being well below 90 degrees, moves up several degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that happens just because they kind of relax, they let go of that particular version of their stretch reflex and that protective mechanism, and they allow that tissue to go to a certain level. Now, that just take that to reset that takes time. I think even so at a neurological level, we can make change fairly quickly, right? So if it really is just like an anxious stretch reflex, you can make change fairly quickly because the
Mm-hmm.
tissue isn't involved. If the tissue is involved, it's myofascial remodeling,
Mm-hmm.
which, according to most studies, is like 6 to 18 months to really change those tissues to be a different length.
Right. Right. And I've
Right. So,
I've also
and pushing isn't going to get you there, right?
no,
Just
it's not.
jamming yourself into isn't going to get you there.
It's not. What I've discovered, and there are a lot of different ways to look at flexibility training and mobility training. Whereas you have everything from Aaron Mattis and the active isolated stretching, where you're only holding for a second and a half, all the way through to super long stretches, which involve 2 to 3 minutes. And I think every person in front of you might require something slightly different. Someone
Yeah.
with a hypertonic system, like you were just describing, I find the longer holds, whereas for the hamstrings, I put them in a doorway and I have them lift a leg up and I have them put it on the door frame and I say, okay, stay 3
Yeah,
minutes,
exactly.
stay.
I'm going to get some water. I'll be back.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they're like,
Yeah.
and do what? I say nothing.
Mhm.
And after 2 weeks of doing this every day, they find that, oh, they're able to go further into the door and relax into the position because they're they're basically waiting out all those stretch receptors, the reflexes, the muscle spindle fibers, all the things that are trying to, fire, you're waiting them out. And eventually
Yeah.
they will relax and trust that they're not going to get hurt.
Right.
I also find that doing it that way, they're not guarded as it when I'm stretching their hamstring. When I'm doing
Right.
a stretch on it, they're passive, but there's also a lot of fear.
Yes. How far is this guy going to push me? I'm not in
Bingo.
control. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they're in control, I find that they're able to relax a little bit deeper, and I see very quick progression by doing that. Because they're in control, they can relax, they can take their time. It's boring and it takes forever to, when you're doing your hamstrings and it takes almost 10 minutes, it's a while. But it works. It does work.
And that's again, that's really working on that nervous system component,
Yes.
right? Allowing the body to understand that. And that is, you're right, that's time and that's patience. And the other thing I wanted to bring up that you brought up really well is when you induce fear in somebody,
Mm-hmm.
like if somebody is over aggressively stretching you or whatever, that the fear component is not going to allow them to relax. That nervous system is going to go into more fight or flight.
Yep.
Fight or flight does not create relaxation of those muscle spindles. It's like everything gets tighter. So that's the other thing too, is it is allowing, it is very like touchy feely. You've got to create this the space, the confidence, the safety to allow those muscles to relax and get to the range of motion that they actually have.
Something that I want to bring up since we're talking about the fear factor of a stretch now. I was actually doing this with a client this morning. It was my third session with him. A lot of issues, incredibly tight hamstrings, low back pain up the wazoo. And so he needed his hamstrings to be stretched. And as I was doing it, I'm monitoring a few things. One, yes, the tissues I'm monitoring in my hands. I'm trying to feel where can they go? And we've all experienced this where you're taking someone into a stretch and you feel like you can go another 10 degrees. There's not as much resistance, but their face and their body tension is telling you, don't go any further.
Don't go there.
You have to respect that. And so understand that you may not get to an end feel, in that stretch for some people who have that heightened nerve sensation or that heightened awareness of, oh my gosh, this person's going to hurt me. And it may take a month or two of doing this regularly for that fear to relax. But I also make sure that I'm watching their eyes, because you're
Hmm.
always going to see the wincing and the pain of a stretch or general pain in their eyes. You'll always see that blinking, or you'll see, them fighting through, or they start breathing really deeply or almost hyperventilating. And you know what? So many times I see people continue to push through that. And I think maybe if you're a physical therapist, okay, you understand the body in a way that maybe you want to push that hard. Okay, that's fine. But for us in the fitness industry, I find back off. Don't push through that fear, because they're going to begin to trust you a lot better if they can relax into it.
And trust themselves better, because really that's what you're trying to do.
Mm,
You're trying to overcome their nervous system's
yes.
resistance, right? That's what you're trying to do. And if the nervous system is jacked up, it's less likely to say, "This is a great idea. I am so happy to be stretching right now." Right? Instead, it's going to go like, "What are you doing to me? I'm under attack. Help!" Right? Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, the nervous system component of it, and then the other one is literally the tissue change component.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I had a friend who had very tight hip flexors, and she worked so hard. She took about 6 months of stretching every day, doing both quad and hip flexor stretches, sustained ones. And after about, it took her 3 to 4 solid months,
Mm-hmm.
she made substantial progress and changed her posture
Mm-hmm.
from being, just slightly hip flexed and anteriorly tilted the pelvis to being more neutral. But it took regular work. So in thinking about trying to change range of motion, this is my just there's maybe some science to support this, but this is what I've always said, what I've seen. Once a week will not do it.
No.
Once a week is really not even maintenance, in all
Mm-hmm.
honesty. Um, Twice a week, 3 times a week are maintenance slash improvement, especially if you find the method that really works for them. And you've talked about one, we'll talk about more as we go.
Yep.
But it's like every day works way better.
Way
If you
better.
find the one stretch that works and you do it every day for a period of time, that's, I find, when tissue change actually happens. And they actually get more range of motion they can sustain, that they're comfortable with, that they can support.
I think that's in training in general. If we think about that,
Yeah.
consistency will create tissue change.
Yeah.
Athletes are always the ones with the best looking bodies, and all, their bodies are the strongest and all of this, but they're also the ones that work out all the time and are training their
Yeah.
bodies more regularly and more consistently. And that has a lot to do with it. But on the other side of things, when it comes to tight muscles, if they're not addressing that tightness, whatever they're doing regularly can actually lead to increased tightness. And I'm thinking about our cyclists whose hip flexors are
Yeah.
incredibly tight because of just their body position for,
Yeah.
we know some people that
Hours.
just went on,
It can be hours.
a multi-day, ride. It's hours and hours on end in that position. And that can really affect the change of the muscle because you're training for long periods of time in that position.
Right. I mean, have you seen, I know, again, I have a lot of cyclists in my extended group of family. And so we'll go to a coffee shop and we'll, hang out at a coffee shop, and a bunch of bicyclists will show up. You watch them get off a bike, and
I know what you're going to
if
say.
they're of any age at all, they're flexed forward at the hips, right? Like, you think they're walking funny because their shoes, because they've got their clips on, but no, it's because they've been sitting with hip flexion for an extended period of time.
Yep.
And sometimes after a few, they'll start to stand up. Maybe some of them don't, but they'll start to kind of get more straight as they go.
Oh, we are having technical
Whatever
difficulty.
you
Oh, there
do
we
is
go.
what you train.
Say that again. You broke up for just a second.
Whatever we do is what we do,
Yes.
right? Whatever we train is what our body gets used to and adapts to. Period. It's that simple. So if you work on mobility, you get more mobility.
Yep.
On
Absolutely.
strength, you get more strength.
And I think when you're thinking about mobility training, something we might want to remind people to do is take a look at what you do on a regular basis. If you are a couch potato, if you are someone who sits at a desk a lot, if you're someone who is in a constantly flexed position, then maybe those are the muscles that are always shortened that you need to start focusing in on, like the hip flexors and the hamstrings and the chest, the anterior shoulder girdle, the things that are going to round us. Perhaps those are the ones that we need to focus in on. And just in general for posture, those are usually the ones that we see are the tightest. But for our athletes who may be one-sided like a baseball pitcher, who are very one-sided, okay, maybe we need to address the other side. Maybe we need to look and see what is tight and what's not. And that's when doing a thorough assessment might actually lead to, oh, did you notice this side is a lot tighter than that side is? So maybe we need to focus on this.
Customization, which
Bingo.
is what we're always talking about is what's really happening there. I'm going to take a different approach because you talked about really overcoming the nervous system with longer, more sustained stretches to really calm the nervous system down and allow you to overcome that. Things like active isolated stretch or PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation patterns, things in a slightly different way of doing a stretch. I find I have to find the method of stretching that works for the client in front of me.
Bingo.
Both physically and psychologically, because there are some clients who will not stay still. Like it's just, I'm sure you've had some too, and it's just not going to happen. Like I know you want me to stretch, but I get so bored, I want to shoot myself and I'm not going to do it, period.
Yep.
So for them, something like, the way that I learned active isolated stretch is basically, let's say I want to stretch the hamstring. I'm going to use the quadricep or the hip flexors to stretch that. So you pull the leg in and then you release it and you bring it into the stretch and let it go, into the stretch and let it go several times, and then hold that stretch perhaps at the end. And for a lot of my clients who cannot be still, their stretch needs to be dynamic.
Yep.
Just for them to comply and do something at all. So for them, I have to find something dynamic. Maybe it's with a TheraBand and they're kind of pulling the band in and out, or they're flexing the leg and doing that, or opening the chest and releasing the chest, whatever it is. But I've got to find some way to make it dynamic for them in order for them to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, those work. Some people that works better. Some people that doesn't work better.
I find the same thing. I find with my athletes, they're the ones who get so bored with stretching that they will not do it. But active isolated stretching, they'll do. It's because it feels more active. It feels like something that is an exercise. So it's like, oh, how many repetitions? If there's a number of repetitions that they can do, they like it.
Exactly.
So for those clients, it can, I find, work wonders. And I think you said it right. It is customization. Because for some people, you need to work with their personality, like you just said, with their tissue type, because for some of them, they're going to respond very well to longer stretches, and some will respond much better. I do find my athletes respond just better in general to active isolated stretching than my, generally sedentary people. So that's, that's anecdotal, but that's what I've found in general. So yeah, the customization is so important when we're talking about that. But also, I want to introduce a concept to you in this sense, whether we're talking about conscious versus incidental mobility. And what I mean by that is when we think of stretching, that's a conscious activity. We're going to now stretch my hamstring. So I am going to use this strap around my foot and I'm going to pull the leg up and hold it for X amount of time and hopefully get a stretch. Versus doing an activity, like for me, I did this on my own body. It is completely only me. It is so testimonial based right now and anecdotal. I'm just telling you now. But I did it and I was kind of amazed at the results. I tested my flexibility on this machine, hamstring stretch machine, that actually told me how many degrees I could go. So I went up and I was at about 70 degrees, and I thought, okay, not too bad. Next time I came in, I did forward lunges onto a BOSU. So I was sort of catching my body and then responding, catching my body and rebounding. And I did 2 sets of 15, nothing that overtaxed me. And I did my hamstring and I got to 85 degrees. And that's the only difference that I made. And I literally was shocked. I looked at the number and I said, okay, the machine's broke because there's no way but I started doing it regularly and I found that I got a lot more range of motion. So for me, I know that either the bouncing, of going down and coming up was allowing the stretch, especially in my upper hamstrings. If that was part of it, I don't know for sure. But for me, I knew that worked a little bit better than just, the static stretching.
Well, what's interesting about that is you aren't really stretching either of your hamstrings in that movement,
No, because you're shortening
right?
as you bend your knee.
You're shortening as you bend your knee, and you're using it dynamically. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you're using it dynamically. And the back one also is being used somewhat dynamically because it's decelerating to try to keep you from falling over and then landing up. So there, I mean, there it's that ability to warm up and move the muscle, get the tissue ready, and in some ways, like this is where I kind of go back to the nervous system again too.
Mm-hmm.
That part of me feels like if the muscle has been woken up, dynamically active, and knows how to support itself, it's able to go farther than it would if it's just like lie down, stretch your hamstring,
Yep. Great point.
right? And I know for me, I don't do lunges in the Bosu, but I do a lot of gardening, and so I'm like, and because I'm a dancer, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I do basically a straight leg lean over, right? So I just lean over and pick something up. Sometimes I'll bend my knees, but sometimes I'll also do that because it works my hamstrings dynamically.
Sure.
Actually, it's, I'm not lifting anything heavy, but I'm just leaning over, keeping my legs straight, and then pulling something up, and then pulling something up. And if I have a day of just doing that, my hamstring flexibility will be much improved from what it would be if I'm, sitting in a chair.
Yeah.
And again, it's just working it dynamically and functionally, actually, in that case.
So that's what I mean by incidentally, is almost
Uh-huh.
putting into your exercises something that is going to achieve that range of motion. Like, for instance, doing a lunge, not only are you getting the stretch in the glutes, the uppermost hamstrings to a certain degree of the leg that's forward, but you're getting a great hip flexor stretch in the leg that's behind you.
Right.
And how many people have we seen can't do a proper lunge because they sit their hips back because their hip flexor is so tight? But by
Yep.
doing lunges regularly over a period of time, suddenly they're able to do it properly, and their hip flexor, even without necessarily working on stretching it, has elongated through just that activity. So that would be an incidental way of sneaking in the back door flexibility training.
Which I think this gets to both some of the neurological component, but also gets, I think, in my thinking anyway, to the myofascial component.
Mm-hmm.
That, a lot of there's a lot of debate and discussion in the fascia community about what aspects of the fascia within and without the muscle tissue and the tendinous tissue is stretching during different activities.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that, addressing the exercise you did, right, that's a little bit ballistic. So you've got essentially some elastic recoil going on, right? You're going
Right.
down, you're coming back, right? Is that right?
Exactly.
So you're really taking that down and back and down and back with that timing that allows that fascial tissue to do that elastic recoil,
Yep.
to, contract and then to release that and contract and release that. And remember, that's not the muscular piece of it. That is the fascia itself's elastic properties that allow it to have some, that just that moment of tension and then release and tension and then release, which also is going to increase your range of motion because you have also facilitated the gliding of the fascia, the stimulation of that whole fascial system, and you've lubricated it and allowed it to work a little bit better
Yeah.
from movement, from movement in those ranges of motion.
Yeah. So I think that including that type of training in someone's routine, if they needed hamstring stretching, for instance, if they needed hip flexor stretching, whatever it is that they need, to begin to add that into their routine, I think would be just as beneficial as doing a static stretch.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think of a lot of the work on the reformer getting to,
Mm-hmm.
Pilates land, where you talk about feet in straps,
Mm.
right? Fabulous exercise. You're lying supine, both your feet are in straps for some resistance on there, some support, and you're taking full ranges of motion in the hips. And it's dynamic. You're working the entire hip musculature dynamically, particularly adductors and hamstrings, not so much abductors and little hip flexor. Um, and it's dynamic. You don't stop moving.
Yep.
And when you're done with that, your range of motion will be increased from where it was when you started. Played with that a bunch of people, and that's a dynamic stretch, and it's working on both the neurological system and it's also working on the myofascial system. And
Mm-hmm.
over time, that can change that.
Yeah, I find that the reformer is a wonderful place to get that elastic recoil because of the springs.
Mm-hmm.
It just
Yep.
feels good. You get that springiness, whereas with cables, you don't get it with cables because the tension never changes. It doesn't increase or decrease. It does in tubing and bands, but to a different degree. But I find the
Mm-hmm.
reformer really does that, especially when doing something like in a lunge position, leg stretch, something that's going to, try and stretch out your hip flexor or whatnot. You can get into sort of a rhythm of going down into that stretch and coming back up and going down into that stretch and coming back up. And that rhythmic nature does get into that, stretch recoil that I like. And I think that can be very
Yeah.
beneficial for clients.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So this is getting to, guys, just so we're wrapping, we're going around
Yeah,
here,
we're going around
so
and
we're
around.
nice,
Sorry.
which is good. No, I think it's good. So it's really what we're trying to do is look at, like we do, like Brian and I do when we get together always, is look at this topic from many different lenses, right? There's a traditional like static stretch. Okay, those are great. But if there is a way to create a dynamic stretch for somebody where you're addressing what they need to address, hip flexors, hamstrings, chest, whatever it is, and you could do it in motion. I mean, two things, right? Number one, that will increase range of motion over time, but it's also going to create mobility with stability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I want to bring up here, because you think about that lunge that you're talking about, or even me with my hamstring, poor form hamstring gardening. Um, there's something about using that range of motion and going into those ranges of motion with neuromuscular support,
Yep.
right? When you're in that lunge, like, you are supported. Those muscles are active around that joint, holding it together, ready to like keep it going. And so it allows that body to go farther because it knows it can. It knows it's safe.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I've always taught, in my mind, stability first, because if the body's not stable, we can't be properly mobile. We can't be, because you are going to stretch the weakest link. If you're trying to get more into, we're talking about mobility and training in that sense. But at the same time, working with different people, we need to take a look at those tissues that need the stretching and need the mobility training, while still providing the flexibility or the mobility. And the one that I use, probably it's the first exercise I teach everybody, is what we call the bent knee fallout, which is just supine on the back, dropping one knee out to the side, but don't let the hips move. Well, we're working on spinal stability, but we're also working on hip mobility.
Yeah.
So it's a great exercise that's simple, and it really is getting them in touch with how far can that go without having everything else move. And I always tell people it's all about what's not moving, not what is moving. And so they begin to feel, oh, okay, I can feel how far that is. And you can see range of motion differences. You can see one side is tighter than the other, or they may not have the neuromuscular connection on one side where everything's sort of falling off the face of the earth, and you reduce their range of motion, and eventually they sort of begin to feel, oh, I got this. I can do this. And they increase their range of motion and they start feeling a little bit better while still creating some spinal stabilization. So it's a great way to sort of hit two birds with one stone in that sense.
And that's what so much of the reformer does as well,
Mm-hmm.
and the Pilates environment does. You think about seated on the chair, leg pumps, right? Legs are moving, hips are moving in flexion and extension, or maybe an external rotation, whatever you're in, but you're keeping the sit bones anchored, pelvis stable, low back stable.
Yep.
Even feet in straps, like your legs are moving, your hips are going through full range of motion, but your low back and your pelvis are stable. And that's functional strength, right? I mean, if you're really trying to train stability, especially the lumbopelvic area,
Mm-hmm.
you have to do it against mobility elsewhere,
Yep.
because that's when it actually is needed. If you just think of walking, right? You've got to be able to allow just the right amount of motion right in that walk, but you have to find that stability against the action of the upper body or the action of the lower body.
Yep.
because that's what we do.
Yep.
That's how we mobilize.
And I think there needs to always be thought of as a balance, because too much
Yeah.
mobility over stability and you're going to have hypermobility. But at the same time, if you have too much stability, which we see in our older adults, and not enough mobility, we see rigidity. So there needs to be that balance where they have enough of one, but not too much. And finding that right balance point, I think, is really important.
There was a there was an interesting moment. My husband dislocated his shoulder at one point. He was 40 at that time. And what was interesting was the doctor said, okay, you are exactly, you're in a weird spot because in people who are under 40, this will generally lead to the shoulder getting hypermobile and causing trouble over time. More arthritis, possible labrum tears, etc., vertigo troubles. If you're over 40, this will often lead to a frozen shoulder
Mm-hmm.
and the range of motion decreasing because of the damage that's done by the hypermobility, by the dislocation. And he said, but you're like right in the middle. So this could go this could go either way, which I just thought was interesting. Because again, I've worked a lot with dancers and I've worked a lot with stiff, with older clients. I've really worked at the full ranges in terms of mobility. And some of it, so much of it for me is one of my very first assessments is, and really this is just observing them moving, is are they mobile or are they not mobile?
Yep.
Really just in a very, very broad, general way. How do they move? Are they stiff when they move? Is it hard for them to get down onto the ground or down onto onto the table? Or are they really easy and fluid? Are they sloppy and floppy? Like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of dancers, if they're not paying attention, are just like collapsed. Essentially, everything just collapses on itself because they're just hanging on their ligaments.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's often where I start. And for me, that first step is, okay, I'm going to focus on stability right away. We may never get to mobility for you because you are like a loose goose, and you, on the other hand, I've got to get you mobile because right now you're so stiff, you can't move at all.
Yep.
So, and there's obviously a big gray area between those, or some parts are stiff and some parts are loose, but that idea of just, a quick, like, okay, more mobile, less mobile. Let's think about where we go from there, whether we go to stability or mobility as the first line of defense, or the first process.
Yeah, and I think you said it best, and we've talked about this before, is just using your eyes. That's your first assessment tool.
Yeah.
Watch them move. How did they sit down? How did they get out of the chair? How much noise did they make getting out of the chair? All of these kind of things that you can see. I walk behind almost every client when I walk them out on the floor. I sort of point to where we're going to go and I watch them move. Are they rotating through the shoulders as they step? Are they taking, decent strides? Are they taking little bitty steps? Are they a robot? Does nothing move?
Right.
And they're just
Yep.
literally walking, everything super rigid. These are going to tell you what you need to do, because if someone is that super rigid, okay, we're going to have to do more range of motion things. And even just sitting down and having them reach overhead one side to the other, doing a little side bending, doing a little rotation could be hugely beneficial for this person because they don't ever move.
Right.
Whereas
Yep.
when you do have the dancer or someone who is a former dancer and still has that floppiness to them, they're going to be tight in certain areas. You're going to see that, but you're also going to see those hips swaying from side to side to side to side, that figure eight, hip. And you're like, wow, okay, yeah, you need a lot of work with that. So that will tell us, immediately just from watching someone move before we put them through any range of motion.
Yeah. How do they take off their shoes? How do they put their purse down? If they got a purse, how do they take their jacket off?
Yep.
I mean, all those little things will show you right away if somebody is, and then how do they stand?
Yep.
I mean, all those things will show you a lot of things, not everything, but you'll get a really quick, like, oh, you are not moving well, or oh, you are like a wiggly person.
Yeah.
And you can make a decision from there.
And what I find interesting is looking at people from right to left as well and front to back.
Yeah.
Because, have someone cross their legs one direction and then make them do the other side. And they can't do it, especially men.
Yep.
One side, no problem. The knee will drop parallel with the other knee. They can fully externally rotate in their hip. On the other side, they can barely get that ankle up over the knee, and that knee is way up pointing to the sky. They have no external rotation. And this is the
Yep.
person, for me, chronic low back pain. And I'm like, well,
Yep.
I can see that we have some things to work on this side, perhaps. And they're going to have often a hyperlord or hypertonic QL on one side. Everything's going to be bound
Yep.
up, whereas the other side is moving a little bit more freely. So these are things that you can have someone do very easily. Like you said, put on your shoes, take off your shoes. How do they do it? Are they able to do that? Are they able to cross their leg, or do they cross one leg and then reach to the floor with the other, with their whole body and lean forward?
Right.
It's like, oh, someone's avoiding some range of motion here.
Uh-huh.
And just watching them move is going to tell you so much.
And to your point, not just there, but you mentioned just observing them when you're doing a stretch or they're doing a stretch, you're doing mobility work with them, and seeing whether you're getting that fear anxiety response on their forehead. I always call it the number 11, like their eyebrows are coming together, so I got a number 11. I said, I don't want to see the number 11. Like,
Yep.
no, like, again, 6 or 7, to your point in terms of effort. And, I don't want to see the number 11, because then I know you've gone beyond where you're comfortable and you started to create tension elsewhere.
Yep.
So,
So
yeah.
let's talk about how we can begin to program these people and what you would recommend to begin to work on programming them if they need to increase their mobility. And you want to do it through a gentle way. You don't want to force it, obviously. But we've talked about, forgive my dog, if you could hear that. I'm recording from home. Normally I do it at the office, but we decided to do it later, so I'm recording from home. So Amazon just dropped something off, I'm sure. But let's talk about the programming aspect. If you want to increase that, we've talked about doing it statically. We've talked about long holds. We've talked about, the active isolated stretching. What other techniques would you use?
A lot of where I start, and especially again, I'm in the Pilates environment, so that's what I'm going to be addressing. But the reformer particularly is so good at just creating dynamic stretching
Mm-hmm.
capability, potential. So feet in straps, even working with feet on the foot bar footwork, where you're going to be doing plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Just drop the heels and rise back up, drop the heels and rise back up. Again, that dynamic nature of
Mm-hmm.
moving into the stretch and moving out of the stretch, and moving into the stretch and moving out of the stretch. I'll often focus, especially with a beginner where I'm not really sure where I'm going to go or what's tight on them. I'll start with really thinking about how can I get this body moving dynamically in different
Mm-hmm.
ranges of motion, right? So, hamstrings to feet in straps, up and down, all the little roll downs, back extension, back flexion, side bending, etc. Even some of the arm work, doing some rows and playing with, am I moving the scapula with the rows, or am I not moving the scapula with the rows? And so that, again, that dynamic nature allows me to work their mobility with stability, because they have to control those movements, and gives me a really good sense of where they're tight, where they're loose, and
Mm-hmm.
where I might have to do some special and specific work,
Yeah,
with maybe some static stretching or specific things for them.
I like that. And I do a similar thing in that a lot of times I'll put them on a chair or a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And on the ball, especially, just doing hip shifts, forward and
Yeah.
back. What can they do? And then side to side. And a lot of times they can't do side to side. They can do a little bit of that forward and back motion, but they do side to side, and you can see that you just see the confusion, like, I don't know how to do that. So then,
Mm-hmm.
okay, hands down by your side, just reach toward the ground, a little side flexion. Can you lift your arm up over your head? Does that cause any pain? Can you do a little side bend in that position? Just to get them to warm up their body through ranges of motion. You can tell them they're doing core work because they are, especially on a ball. And what's nice about that is, because they're on an unstable surface, or a minorly unstable surface, depending on how comfortable they are, but they're getting some stability work at the same time. They're
Yeah.
stabilizing while doing a little bit of mobility. Then you can have them, reach forward with one arm and back with the other, so they get some thoracic rotation going. So just getting that moving can make them feel
Yeah.
so much better. And that's something you can have them do at home, at the office, if they want to do it in their chair. Just getting them to move better. and then taking that into maybe a tube row where they're standing and they're able to get that thoracic rotation and they really reach forward, or a tube press, and have them really push through the range of motion. And I'm not using a lot of resistance, but allowing them to really go through that range of motion and push, 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 push. So they really have to turn through their thoracic and then release and come all the way back. And it just reminds the body, hey, we're allowed to do this. It's okay. And almost to a person, one side feels good, the other side's sticky. Not quite as good, not quite as lubricated.
Yep.
But after 10 or 15 repetitions, they're like, oh, things are feeling a little bit better. Oh, okay, this feels good. And then I can take them and do a little bit more specific telescope arms, pinwheel, lying on their side so they get the thoracic rotation. And, if it's a woman, I'll often say it's kind of like a dance. You want to just sort of relax into it and allow your body to move. Whereas not all guys will understand, that thing, because the first thing that comes out of most of their mouth, I don't dance. Okay. But just movement. Just allow the body to move. And you'll be surprised at how much movement and mobility that they're going to get. And you don't really need a whole lot. You don't need to buy a lot of equipment.
Mm-mm.
You were talking about a study. Why don't you bring that up? Was it in Australia?
I think it was in Australia. They did a study, I think it was in Australia, with a bunch of military recruits. So this is young men primarily, and 18 to 25 or 26, something like that. And this was a study that made a lot of splash for a while, because they basically had half of them do some mobility training or flexibility training, they were calling it then, and the other half not. And they're basically trying to see whether that decreased their likelihood of injury, was really what they were looking for. And the study was absolutely like, it didn't make any difference whatsoever in their performance or their injury rate. So great, that's fine. I look at that and go, well, good. If that worked for them, that's fine. They're young men. They're
Exactly.
training heavily at that point. So chances are good they're getting the amount of mobility they need to do their tasks.
Right.
Because, these are early guys in the Army. They're doing training every day. So that alone may be keeping them in good shape, and they may not need to do flexibility work on top of what they're doing, to speak about the dynamic flexibility we're talking about.
Yep.
But people are like, oh, I never need to stretch again. It's like, well, you're not a 20-something military recruit. You may be a 50-something office desk jockey who's had a 60-hour-a-week CEO job with a lot of stress for the last 10 years, and you haven't moved at all, and
Yep.
you're not sleeping well, and your diet sucks, and chances are good you do need to stretch because you haven't moved at all in a long time, right? So it's you always have to look at these studies with who are they talking about? Who are the people that were actually participating in the study? And 9 times out of 10, it's college students, because they're physical therapy, graduate students that need to do a study. And who do they have? They have like 20 somethings, which is fine. But as any of you who are over that know, the body changes.
Yeah, a little bit.
Over time.
What you said was
flexibility changes a lot.
exactly right. The variables. When you look at any of these studies, what are those variables that can be changed? And age, tissues. When we were doing physical training in ROTC, okay, the exercises I'm primarily thinking about are body weight exercises. We called it the 8-count push-up, which is basically a burpee with 2 push-ups instead of 1. Jumping jacks, windmills, all these things that are enhancing range of motion anyway. Just
Totally
moving
dynamic.
the body and being very dynamic. So you're already doing all of that training. So adding flexibility training to it and static stretching, I could see being a complete kind of waste of time for these guys, because they're already doing it. Whereas my 55-year-old, my 65-year-old, it's going to be a different story. Mm-hmm. And also the person in front of you makes the biggest difference on everything, because I can take a 30-year-old who looks in good shape but hasn't done anything their whole life versus a 65-year-old who plays, racquetball and pickleball and cycles and does all this kind of stuff. And you know what? That older person probably has better tissue tolerance, and better mobility than the younger person does.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you also have to look at the person in front of you and really realize, okay, what can they do? And realize that that's the biggest variable to deal with.
So I think to start kind of wrapping this up or rounding this together, it's interesting where we've come to, because I think we were
Mm-hmm.
both thinking of this as, how do you stretch somebody and how does that work? Um, and I think I feel like where we've come to is a lot of what we do anyway is dynamic
Yep.
and creates the range of motion, the functional range of motion that we want through movement. And I would say that that's generally true, but there are certainly situations where I know I need to address a certain limitation. Whether it's hamstrings, chest, hip flexors, those are typical, maybe adductors, maybe lateral flexion, maybe rotation. Like there's things that I just know that are not getting addressed
Yep.
in whatever they're doing in their daily life, or there's a deficit there to start with. And those are the ones I need to work on. I love the work with the warm that you do. I often do just a standing warm up looking at spinal mobility. I'll do little squats, I do roll down, I do a little extension work, I do some rotation work, I do some lateral flexion work standing.
Yep.
Takes 5 minutes at the beginning of every session and just kind of gets everything moving, gets the body parts working together, and then we go into more resistance and more specificity.
I agree.
So,
I agree completely. I think just in general, people need to move more, not less.
yeah, period.
And when
Period.
we are
Yeah.
moving more, we're going to get them to move better over time. And
Yep.
like you said, some people do need specificity. For myself, I realized one of my hips was tighter, and it was the side that I was having more back pain on. It took me a year of stretching 5 times a week, using the Pilates ladder, putting my leg up, dropping it, trying to lean forward over it to get that external rotation. But you know what? They're even now. But it took a year. Remodeling takes
That's
time.
that's what exactly. I just want to point that out. It took a year
Yeah.
of consistent work.
Yeah.
Right? And Brian is not 20 anymore, in
New.
spite of his, handsome good looks. He's not 20 anymore. So, that's one of those things, right? That, yeah, you just have to be consistent with it and change will happen, but patience is necessary.
Yeah. And I think that's something we need to really mention to our clients is that this is not
Yeah.
going to happen overnight. Remodeling takes time.
Yep.
Strength building takes time too. And, everybody talks about muscle memory. And yes, you can get your strength back faster, I think, than your flexibility. It's going to take time, but it can come back with consistency and dedication.
And that's where we always stay optimistic. This is one of the things that I tell all my teachers all the time. Is one of the most important things you can do is never say never.
Yep.
Right? It's like you have no idea, and I say this to clients all the time. Like I have no idea how much better you can get than you are now. I
Yep.
don't care what age you are. I don't care what your condition is. I have no idea until we start working
Yep.
and see what's possible for you.
Yep.
And I mean, I've seen so many people at every age change radically in terms of their body's capabilities, their comfort level, their performance level at every age,
Yep.
just through, consistency and committing.
Yep. Absolutely. So let's wrap this up a little bit and do a minor review because we covered a lot of things and we went around the bend a few times. And I'll be the first one to admit that I led the charge on that around the bend thing. That's okay. A lot came up. So number one, I think the one thing we need to do is watch our clients move.
First and foremost. And for me, part of that is quick bucket, mobile, stiff. Just quick bucket.
Yep.
Just because that'll give you some place to start.
Exactly. Watch them move. Watching them move is also going to tell you what needs to be worked on for flexibility, but also what needs to be worked on for stability really quickly.
Yep.
You can see that.
Yep.
Remember that everybody's an individual. So for some people, what might work is more active isolated stretching, more of a shorter hold, many, many repetitions. Hold for a second and a half, maybe do 10 repetitions of whatever that stretch is. And other people need the longer sustained holds to really relax into it. You're going to find whatever works for that client, and be willing to make those changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Be flexible. It's easy, and I've seen this many times. Trainers getting very dogmatic about their particular stretching philosophy,
Yes.
and I've just found it's not helpful because if a client isn't complying, if they're not going to do the stretches, it doesn't matter. If that isn't the method that is going to work for them physically or psychologically, if they're not going to do it, it's not going to do them any good. So you got to find a way to get them to do it.
Yep. And finally, be consistent. It needs to
Yeah.
happen often. I tell all of everybody who comes to me, I give everybody homework. And they say, well, how often do I have to do this? And I say every day. And I know if I say every day, I'll be lucky to get them 3 to 4 times a week.
It's okay.
But if I say 3
You got to
times
set
a
the
week,
expectation high.
yeah, if I say
You'll
3
get
times,
nothing.
I'll get 1 if I'm lucky.
Exactly. No, you got to see every day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So by focusing on consistency and maybe giving them less, so it's only 10 minutes worth of work a
Yeah.
day. Because some people need
Yeah.
less because they don't have time. Other people need a real regime and need 30 to 45 minutes to feel like they've done something. Again, personalities. Go with the
Yeah.
personality of the client. Give them what they need. If it's shorter, give them shorter. If it's longer, give them longer. But they need to be consistent. You follow these guidelines, and I think you're going to see some pretty radical changes in their flexibility and their mobility work. And also, don't be afraid to include ranges of motion through the exercises themselves.
Right. Because that's the other thing I would add is that really came out of this for me is be aware of what if they have a particular thing they need to work on, and how are you addressing that in their exercises, right? Not just in their stretching or their official mobility work or their myofascial release or whatever it is, but how are you addressing it in their exercises? Are you actually working through that range of motion dynamically in what you're doing? Because that may be doing as much good, to Brian's point, as any other kind of work that you're doing. And think about that. Think about the mobility work you're doing while you're doing a strength exercise or resistance exercise. It's an
Yeah.
important thing to just have in your mind.
And also, something else to think about is take a look at the whole program that you've designed. Because I
Mm-hmm.
find that sometimes you'll be doing things that can actually be counterproductive at the same time.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
you have to take a look at that as well. What are your goals? How are we going to get there? And like I say, get them to move. I think those are
Yep,
the things we need to work on.
absolutely.
All right. Well, I think we covered a lot today,
We did. I learned a few things as always. I
as
always appreciate
always.
that.
Exactly. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. This is Moving Conversations. You can always reach us at movingconvos@gmail.com. Movingconversationslive.com is where you can find out where we're going to be on the road, where we're going to be teaching. And if you'd like us to come and teach in your facility, hit us up either on our socials, Instagram, Moving Combos, and check out our Instagram page for all of our anatominis and things like that. So you'll learn a lot more in little bite-sized nuggets. And like I say, check us out on the web and see where we'll be. And if you want us to come to a space near you or to your studio, invite us. We'd be happy to come.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right. And for Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We'll see you next time.